I want to talk to you today a little bit about predictable irrationality. And my interest in irrational behavior started many years ago in hospital. I was burned very badly. And if you spend a lot of time in hospital, you'll see a lot of types of irrationalities. And the one that particularly bothered me in the burn department was the process by which the nurses took the bandage off me. Now, you must have all taken a Band-Aid off at some point, and you must have wondered what's the right approach. Do you rip it off quickly, short duration but high intensity, or do you take your Band-Aid off slowly? You take a long time, but each second is not as painful. Which one of those is the right approach? The nurses in my department thought that the right approach was the ripping one. So they would grab hold and they would rip, and they would grab hold and they would rip. And because I had 70% of my body burned, it would take about an hour. And as you can imagine, I hated that moment of ripping with incredible intensity. And I would try to reason with them and say, why don't we try something else? Why don't we take it a little longer, maybe 2 hours instead of an hour, and have less of this intensity? And the nurses told me two things. They told me that they had the right model of the patient, that they knew what was the right thing to do to minimize my pain. And they also told me that the word patient doesn't mean to make suggestions or interfere or... This is not just in Hebrew, by the way, it's in every language I've had experience with so far. And you know, there wasn't much I could do, and they kept on doing what they were doing. And about 3 years later, when I left the hospital, I started studying at the university. And one of the most interesting lessons I learned was that there is an experimental method, that if you have a question, you can create a replica of this question in some abstract way, and you can try to examine this question, maybe learn something about the world. So that's what I did. I was still interested in this question of how do you take bandages of burn patients. So originally I didn't have much money, so I went to a hardware store and I bought a carpenter's vise, and I would bring people to the lab and I would put their finger in it and I would crunch it a little bit. And I would crunch it for long periods and short periods, and pain it went up and pain it went down, and with breaks and without breaks, all kinds of versions of pain. And when I finished hurting people a little bit, I would ask them, so how painful was this? Or how painful was this? Or if you had to choose between the last two, which one would you choose? I kept on doing this for a while. And then, like all good academic projects, I got more funding. I moved to sounds, electrical shocks. I even had a pain suit that I could get people to feel much more pain. But at the end of this process, what I learned was that the nurses were wrong. Here were wonderful people with good intentions and plenty of experience, and nevertheless, they were getting things wrong predictably all the time. It turns out that because we don't encode duration in the way that we encode intensity, I would have had less pain if the duration would have been longer and the intensity was lower. It turns out it would have been better to start with my face, which was much more painful, and move toward my legs, giving me a trend of improvement over time that would have been also less painful. And it also turns out it would have been good to give me breaks in the middle to kind of recuperate from the pain. All of these would have been great things to do, and my nurses had no idea. And from that point on, I started thinking, are the nurses the only people in the world who get things wrong in this particular decision, or is it a more general case? And it turns out it's a more general case. There's a lot of mistakes we do. And I want to give you one example of one of these irrationalities, and I want to talk to you about cheating. And the reason I picked cheating is because it's interesting, but also it tells us something, I think, about the stock market situation we're in. So my interest in cheating started when Enron came on the scene, exploded all of a sudden, and I started thinking about what is happening here. Is it the case that there is kind of a few apples who are capable of doing these things, or are we talking a more endemic situation that many people are actually capable of behaving this way? So, like we usually do, I decided to do a simple experiment, and here's how it went. If you were in the experiment, I would pass you a sheet of paper with 20 simple math problems that everybody could solve, but I wouldn't give you enough time. When the 5 minutes were over, I would say, pass me the sheets of paper and I'll pay you $1 per question. People did this. I would pay people $4 for their task. On average, people would solve 4 problems. Other people I would tempt to cheat. I would pass the sheet of paper. When the 5 minutes are over, I would say, please shred the piece of paper, put the little pieces in your pocket or in your backpack, and tell me how many questions you got correctly. People now solve 7 questions on average. Now, it wasn't as if there was a few bad apples, a few people who cheated a lot. Instead, what we saw is a lot of people who cheat a little bit. Now, in the economic theory, cheating is a very simple cost-benefit analysis. You say, what's the probability of being caught? How much do I stand to gain from cheating? And how much punishment would I get if I get caught? And you weigh these options out, you do the simple cost-benefit analysis, and you decide whether it's worthwhile to commit the crime or not. So we tried to test this. For some people, we varied how much money they could get away with, how much money they could steal. We paid them 10 cents per correct question, 50 cents, $1, $5, $10 per correct question. You would expect that as the amount of money on the table increases, people would cheat more, but in fact it wasn't the case. We got a lot of people cheating, but still by a little bit. What about the probability of being caught? Some people shredded half the sheet of paper, so there was some evidence left. Some people shredded the whole sheet of paper. Some people shredded everything, went out of the room and paid themselves from a ball of money that had over $100. You would expect that as the probability of being caught goes down, people would cheat more, but again, this was not the case. Again, a lot of people cheated just by a little bit, and they were unsensitive to these economic incentives. So we said, if people are not sensitive to the economic rational theory explanations, to these forces, what could be going on? And we thought maybe what is happening is that there are 2 forces. At one hand, we all want to look at ourselves in the mirror and feel good about ourselves. So we don't want to cheat. On the other hand, we can cheat a little bit and still feel good about ourselves. So maybe what is happening is that there's a level of cheating we can't go over, but we can still benefit from cheating at a low degree as long as it doesn't change our impressions about ourselves. We call this like a personal fudge factor. Now, how would you test a personal fudge factor? Initially, we said, what can we do to shrink the fudge factor? So we got people to the lab, and we said, we have 2 tasks for you today. First, we asked half the people to recall either 10 books they read in high school or to recall the 10 commandments. And then we tempted them with cheating. Turns out the people who tried to recall the 10 commandments, and in our sample nobody could recall the 10 commandments, but those people who tried to recall the 10 commandments, given the opportunity to cheat, did not cheat at all. It wasn't that the more religious people, the people who remembered more of the commandment, cheated less, and the less religious people, the people who couldn't remember almost any commandment, cheated more. The moment people thought about trying to recall the 10 commandments, they stopped cheating. In fact, even when we give self-declared atheists the task of swearing on the Bible and we give them a chance to cheat, they don't cheat at all. Now, 10 commandments is something that is hard to bring into the education system, so we said, why don't we get people to sign the honor code? So we got people to sign. I understand that this short survey falls under the MIT honor code. Then they shredded it, no cheating whatsoever. And this is particularly interesting because MIT doesn't have an honor code. So all this was about decreasing the fudge factor. What about increasing the fudge factor? The first experiment, I walked around MIT and I distributed 6 packs of Cokes in the refrigerators. These were common refrigerators for the undergrads. And I came back to measure what we technically call the half-lifetime of Coke. How long does it last in the refrigerators? And you can expect it doesn't last very long. People take it. In contrast, I took a plate with 6 $1 bills and I left those plates in the same refrigerators. No bill was ever disappeared. Now, this is not a good social science experiment. So to do it better, I did the same experiment as I described to you before. A third of the people, we passed the sheet, they gave it back to us. A third of the people, we passed it, they shredded it, they came to us and said, Mr. Experimenter, I solved X problems, give me X dollars. A third of the people, when they finished shredding the piece of paper, they came to us and said, Mr. Experimenter, I solved X problems, give me X tokens. We did not pay them with dollars, we paid them with something else. And then they took this something else, they walked 12 feet to the side and exchanged it for dollars. Think about the following intuition. How bad would you feel about taking a pencil from work home compared to how bad would you feel about taking 10 cents from a petty cash box? These things feel very differently. Would being a step removed from cash for a few seconds by being paid by a token make a difference? Our subjects double their cheating. I'll tell you what I think about this in the stock market in a minute. But this did not solve the big problem I had with Enron yet, because in Enron there's also a social element. People see each other behaving. In fact, every day when we open the news, we see examples of people cheating. What does this causes us? So we did another experiment. We got a big group of students to be in the experiment, and we prepaid them. So everybody got an envelope with all the money for the experiment, and we told them that at the end, we asked them to pay us back the money they didn't make. Okay? The same thing happens when we give people the opportunity to cheat. They cheat just by a little bit, all the same. But in this experiment, we also hired an acting student. This acting student stood up after 30 seconds and said, "I solved everything. What do I do now?" And the experimenter said, "If you finished everything, go home. That's it. The task is finished." So now we had a student, an acting student, that was a part of the group. Nobody knew it was an actor, and they clearly cheated in a very, very serious way. What would happen to the other people in the group? Will they cheat more or will they cheat less? Here is what happens. It turns out it depends on what kind of sweatshirt they're wearing. Here's the thing. We ran this at Carnegie Mellon in Pittsburgh. And at Pittsburgh, there are two big universities, Carnegie Mellon and University of Pittsburgh. All of the subjects sitting in the experiment were Carnegie Mellon students. When the actor was getting up, was a Carnegie Mellon student. He was actually a Carnegie Mellon student, but he was a part of their group. Cheating went up. But when he actually had the University of Pittsburgh sweatshirt, cheating went down. Now this is important because remember, when the moment the student stood up, it made it clear to everybody that they could get away with cheating. Because the experimenter said, "You finished everything, go home," and they worked with the money. So it wasn't so much about the probability of being caught again, it was about the norms for cheating. If somebody from our in-group cheats, and we see them cheating, we feel it's more appropriate as a group to behave this way. But if it's somebody from another group, these terrible people, I mean not terrible in this, but somebody we don't want to associate ourselves with, from another university, another group, all of a sudden people's awareness of honesty goes up, a little bit like the Ten Commandments experiment, and people cheat even less. So what have we learned from this about cheating? We've learned that a lot of people can cheat. They cheat just by a little bit. When we remind people about their morality, they cheat less. When we get bigger distance from cheating, from the object of money, for example, people cheat more. And when we see things of cheating around us, particularly if it's a part of our in-group, cheating goes up. Now, if we think about this in terms of the stock market, think about what happens. What happens in a situation when you create something where you pay people a lot of money to see reality in a slightly distorted way? Would they not be able to see it this way? Of course they would. What happens when you do other things, like you remove things from money? You call them stock or stock option, derivatives, mortgage-backed securities. Could it be that with those more distant things, it's not a token for 1 second, it's something that is many steps removed from money for much longer time? Could it be that people would cheat even more? And what happened to the social environment when people see other people behave around them? I think all of those forces worked in a very bad way in the stock market. More generally, I want to tell you something about behavioral economics. We have many intuitions in our life, and the point is that many of these intuitions are wrong. The question is, are we going to test those intuitions? We can think about how we're going to test this intuition in our private life, in our business life, and most particularly when it goes to policy, when we think about things like No Child Left Behind, when you create new stock markets, when you create other policies, taxation, healthcare, and so on. And the difficulty of testing our intuition was the big lesson I learned when I went back to the nurses to talk to them. So I went back to talk to them and tell them what I found out about removing bandages. And I learned two interesting things. One was that my favorite nurse, Etty, told me that I did not take her pain into consideration. She said, of course, it was very painful for you, but think about me as a nurse. Removing the bandages of somebody I liked and had to do it repeatedly over a long period of time, creating so much torture, was not something that was good for me too. And she said maybe part of the reason was that it was difficult for her. But it was actually more interesting than that, because she said, I did not think that your intuition was right. I thought my intuition was correct. So if you think about all of your intuitions, think about it's very hard to believe that your intuition is wrong. And she said, given the fact that I thought my intuition was right, she thought her intuition was right, it was very difficult for her to accept doing a difficult experiment to try and check whether she was wrong. But the fact, this is the situation we're all in all the time. We have very strong intuitions about all kinds of things. Our own ability, how the economy works, how we should pay school teachers. But unless we start testing those intuitions, we're not going to do better. And just think about how better my life would have been if these nurses would have been willing to check their intuition, and how everything would have been better. We would just start doing more systematic experimentation of our intuitions. Thank you very much. I'll tell you a little bit about irrational behavior, not yours, of course, other people's. After being at MIT for a few years, I realized that writing academic papers is not that exciting. I don't know how many of those you read, but it's not fun to read and often not fun to write, even worse to write. So I decided to try and write something more fun. And I came up with an idea that I will write a cookbook. And the title for my cookbook was going to be Dining Without Crumbs, The Art of Eating Over the Sink. And it was going to be a look at life through the kitchen. And I was quite excited about this. I was going to talk about a little bit about research, a little bit about the kitchen. We do so much in the kitchen, I thought this would be interesting. And I wrote a couple of chapters and I took it to MIT Press and they said, cute, but not for us. Go and find somebody else. I tried other people and everybody said the same thing, cute, not for us. Until somebody said, look, if you're serious about this, you first have to write a book about your research. You have to publish something, and then you'll get the opportunity to write something else. If you really want to do it, you have to do it. So I said, I really don't want to write about my research. I do this all day long. I want to write something else, something a bit more free, less constrained. And this person was very forceful and said, look, that's the only way you'll ever do it. So I said, okay, if I have to do it, I had a sabbatical. I said, I'll write about my research if there's no other way, and then I'll get to do my cookbook. So I wrote a book on my research, and it turns out to be quite fun in two ways. First of all, I enjoyed writing, but the more interesting thing was that I started learning from people. It's a fantastic time to write because there's so much feedback you can get from people. People write me about their personal experience and about their examples and what they disagree and nuances. And even being here, the last few days, I've known really heights of obsessive behavior I never thought about, which I think is just fascinating. I want to tell you a little bit about irrational behavior, and I want to start by giving you some examples of visual illusion as a metaphor for rationality. So think about these two tables, and you must have seen this illusion. If I ask you what's longer, the vertical line on the table on the left or the horizontal line on the table on the right, which one seems longer? Can anybody see anything but the left one being longer? No, right? It's impossible. But the nice thing about visual illusion is we can easily demonstrate mistakes. So I can put some lines on, doesn't help. I can animate the lines, and to the extent you believe me, I didn't shrink the lines, which I didn't. I've proven to you that your eyes were deceiving you. Now, the interesting thing about this is when I take the lines away, it's as if you haven't learned anything in the last minute. You can't look at this and say, okay, now I see reality as it is, right? It's impossible to overcome this sense that this is indeed longer. Our intuition is really fooling us in a repeatable, predictable, consistent way. There's almost nothing we can do about it aside from taking a ruler and starting to measure it. Here's another one. This is one of my favorite illusions. What do you see the color that the top arrow is pointing to? The brown, thank you. The bottom one, yellow. Turns out they're identical. Can anybody see them as identical? Very, very hard. I can cover the rest of the cube up, and if I cover the rest of the cube, you can see that they're identical. And if you don't believe me, you can get the slide later and do some arts and crafts and see that they're identical. But again, it's the same story, that if we take the background away, the illusion comes back, right? There's no way for us not to see this illusion. I guess maybe if you're colorblind, I don't think you can see that. I want you to think about illusion as a metaphor. Vision is one of the best things we do. We have a huge part of our brain dedicated to vision, bigger than dedicated to anything else. We do more vision, more hours of the day than we do anything else. And we're evolutionarily designed to do vision. And if we have these predictable, repeatable mistakes in vision, in which we're so good at, what's the chance that we don't make even more mistakes in something we're not as good at? For example, financial decision making. Something we don't have an evolutionary reason to do, we don't have a specialized part of the brain, and we don't do that many hours of the day. And the argument is that on those cases, it might be the issue that we actually make many more mistakes. And worse, not have an easy way to see them. Because in visual illusions, we could easily demonstrate the mistakes. In cognitive illusion, it's much, much harder to demonstrate to people the mistakes. So I want to show you some cognitive illusion, or decision-making illusion in the same way. This is one of my favorite plots in social sciences. It's from a paper by Johnson and Goldstein. And it basically shows the percentage of people who indicate that they would be interested in giving their organs to donation. And these are different countries in Europe, and you basically see two types of countries. Countries on the right that seems to be giving a lot, and countries on the left that seems to be giving very little, or much less. The question is why? Why do some countries give a lot and some countries give a little? When you ask people this question, they usually think that it has to be something about culture, right? How much do you care about people? Giving your organs to somebody else is probably about how much you care about society, how linked you are. Or maybe it is about religion. But if you look at this plot, you could see that countries that we think about as very similar actually exhibit very different behavior. For example, Sweden is all the way on the right, and Denmark, that we think is culturally very similar, is all the way on the left. Germany is on the left, and Austria is on the right. The Netherlands is on the left, and Belgium is on the right. And finally, depending on your particular version of European similarity, you can think about the UK and France as either similar culturally or not. But it turns out that from organ donation, they're very different. By the way, the Netherlands is an interesting story. You see, the Netherlands is kind of the biggest of the small group. Turns out that they got to 28% after mailing every household in the country a letter begging people to join this organ donation program. Right, so the expression, begging only gets you so far? It's 28% in organ donation. But whatever the countries on the right are doing, they're doing a much better job than begging. So what are they doing? Turns out the secret has to do with the form at the DMV. And here's the story. The countries on the left have a form at the DMV that looks something like this. Check the box below if you want to participate in the organ donor program. And what happens? People don't check and they don't join. The countries on the right, the ones that give a lot, have a slightly different form. It says check the box below if you don't want to participate. Interestingly enough, when people get this, they again don't check, but now they join the program. Now, think about what this means. We wake up in the morning and we feel we make decisions. We wake up in the morning and we open the closet and we feel that we decide what to wear, and we open the refrigerator and we feel that we decide what to eat. And what this is actually saying that much of these decisions are not residing within us. They're residing by the person who's designing that form. When you walk into the DMV, the person who designed the form will have a huge influence on what you'll end up doing. Now, it's also very hard to intuit these results. Think about it for yourself. How many of you believe that if you went to renew your license tomorrow and you went to the DMV and you would encounter one of these forms, that would actually change your own behavior? Very, very hard to think that it will influence us, right? We can say, oh, these funny Europeans, of course it would influence them. But when it comes to us, we have such a feeling that we're in the driver's seats. We have such a feeling that we're in control and we are making the decision that it's very hard to even accept the idea that we actually have an illusion of making a decision rather than actual decision. Now, you might say, these are decisions we don't care about. In fact, by definition, these are decisions about something that will happen to us after we die. How could we care about something less than something that happens after we die? So a standard economist, somebody who believes in rationality, would say, the cost of lifting the pencil and marking a V is higher than the possible benefit of the decision, so that's why we get this effect. But in fact, it's not because it's easy, it's not because it's trivial, it's not because we don't care, it's the opposite. It's because we care, it's difficult, and it's complex, and it's so complex that we don't know what to do. And because we have no idea what to do, we just pick whatever it was that was chosen for us. I'll give you one more example for this. This is from a paper by Redelmeyer and Shafir. And they said, would this effect also happens to experts? People who are well paid, experts in their decisions, do it a lot. And they basically took a group of physicians and they presented to them a case study of a patient. And they said, here's a patient, he's a 67-year-old farmer, he's been suffering from a right hip pain for a while. And then they said to the physician, yes, you decided a few weeks ago that nothing is working for this patient. All these medications, nothing seems to be working, so you refer the patient to hip replacement therapy, hip replacement, okay? So the patient is on a path to have his hip replaced. And then they said, half the physician, they said, yesterday, you reviewed the patient's case and you realized that you forgot to try one medication. You did not try ibuprofen. What do? Do you pull the patient back and try ibuprofen, or do you let them go and have hip replacement? Well, the good news is that most physicians in this case decided to pull the patient and try ibuprofen. Very good for the physicians. The other group of the physicians, they said, yesterday when you reviewed the case, you discovered there were two medications you didn't try out yet, ibuprofen and piroxicam. They said, your two medications didn't try out yet. What do? You let them go, or you pull them back. And if you pull them back, do you try ibuprofen or piroxicam? Which one? Now, think of it. This decision makes it as easy to let the patient continue with hip replacement, but pulling them back all of a sudden becomes more complex. There's one more decision. What happens now? Majority of the physicians now choose to let the patient go to hip replacement. I hope this worries you, by the way, when you go to see your physician. The thing is that no physician would ever say, piroxicam, ibuprofen, hip replacement, let's go for hip replacement. But the moment you set this as the default, it has a huge power on whatever people end up doing. I'll give you a couple of more examples of irrational decision making. Imagine I give you a choice. Do you want to go for a weekend to Rome, all expenses paid, hotel, transportation, food, breakfast, the continental breakfast, everything, or a weekend in Paris? Now, weekend in Paris, weekend in Rome, these are different things. They have different food, different culture, different art. Now, imagine I added a choice to the set that nobody wanted. Imagine I said a weekend in Rome, a weekend in Paris, or having your car stolen. Now, it's a funny idea, because why would having your car stolen in this set influence anything? But what if the option to have your car stolen was not exactly like this? What if it was a trip to Rome, all expenses paid, transportation, breakfast, but doesn't include coffee in the morning? If you want coffee, you have to pay for it yourself. It's €2.50. Now, in some ways, given that you can have Rome with coffee, why would you possibly want Rome without coffee? It's like having your car stolen. It's an inferior option. But guess what happened? The moment you add Rome without coffee, Rome with coffee become more popular, and people choose it. The fact that you have Rome without coffee makes Rome with coffee look superior, and not just to Rome without coffee, even superior to Paris. Here are two examples of this principle. This was an ad from The Economist a few years ago that gave us three choices. An online subscription for $59, a print subscription for $125, or you could get both for $125. Now, I looked at this and I called up The Economist and I tried to figure out what were they thinking. And they passed me from one person to another, until eventually I got to a person who was in charge of the website, and I called them up and they went to check what was going on, and the next thing I know, the ad is gone and no explanation. So I decided to do the experiment that I would have loved The Economist to do with me. I took this and I gave it to 100 MIT students. I said, what would you choose? And these are the market share. Most people wanted the combo deal. Thankfully, nobody wanted the dominated option. That means our students can read. But now, if you have an option that nobody wants, you would take it off, right? So I printed another version of this when I eliminated the middle option, and I gave it to another 100 students. Here's what happens. Now the most popular option became the least popular, and the least popular became the most popular. What was happening is that option that was useless in the middle was useless in the sense that nobody wanted it. But it wasn't useless in the sense that it helped people figure out what they wanted. In fact, relative to the option in the middle, which was get only the print for 125, the print and web for 125 looked like a fantastic deal. And as a consequence, people chose it. The general idea here, by the way, is that we actually don't know our preferences that well. And because we don't know our preferences that well, we're susceptible to all of these influences from the external forces, the defaults, the particular options that are presented to us, and so on. One more example of this, people believe that when we deal with physical attraction, we see somebody and we know immediately whether we like them or not, attracted or not. This is why we have these 4-minute dates. So I decided to do this experiment with people. I'll show you graphic images of people, not real people. The experiment was with people. I showed some people a picture of Tom and a picture of Jerry, and I said, who do you want to date, Tom or Jerry? But for half the people, I added an ugly version of Jerry. I took Photoshop and I made Jerry slightly less attractive. The other people, I added an ugly version of Tom. And the question was, will ugly Jerry and ugly Tom help the respective more attractive brothers? And the answer was absolutely yes. When ugly Jerry was around, Jerry was popular. When ugly Tom was around, Tom was popular. This, of course, has two very clear implications for life in general. If you ever go bar hopping, who do you want to take with you? You want a slightly uglier version of yourself. Similar, but slightly uglier. And the second point, of course, is that if somebody else invites you, you know how they think about you. Now you're getting it. What is the general point? The general point is that when we think about economics, we have this beautiful view of human nature. You know, what a piece of work is man, how noble in reason. We have this view of ourselves, of others. The behavioral economics perspective is slightly less generous to people. In fact, in medical terms, that's our view. But there is a silver lining. And the silver lining is, I think, kind of the reason that behavioral economics is interesting and exciting. You know, are we Superman or are we Homer Simpson? When it comes to building the physical world, we kind of understand our limitations. We build steps and we build these things that not everybody can use, obviously, but we build them. We understand our limitations and we build around it. But for some reason, when it comes to the mental world, when we design things like healthcare and retirement and stock markets, we somehow forget the idea that we're limited. And I think if we understood our cognitive limitations in the same way that we understand our physical limitation, even if they don't stare us in the face in the same way, we could design a better world. And that, I think, is the hope of this thing. Thank you very much. So, I was in hospital for a long time, and a few years after I left, I went back, and the chairman of the burn department was very excited to see me. He said, Dan, I have a fantastic new treatment for you. I was very excited. I walked with him to his office, and he explained to me that when I shave, I have little black dots on the left side of my face where the hair is, but on the right side of my face, I was badly burned, so I have no hair, and this creates lack of symmetry. And what's the brilliant idea he had? He was going to tattoo little black dots on the right side of my face and make me look very symmetric. It sounded interesting. He asked me to go and shave. Let me tell you, this was a strange way to shave because I thought about it and I realized that the way I was shaving then would be the way I would shave for the rest of my life because I had to keep the width the same. When I got back to his office, I wasn't really sure. I said, can I see some evidence for this? So he showed me some pictures of little cheeks with little black dots, not very informative. I said, you know, what happened when I grow older and my hair becomes white? What would happen then? Oh, don't worry about it. He said, we have laser, we can whiten it out. But I was still concerned, so I said, you know what? I'm not going to do it. And then came one of the biggest guilt trips of my life. This is coming from a Jewish guy, right? So that means a lot. And he said, Dan, what's wrong with you? Do you enjoy looking non-symmetric? Do you have some kind of perverted pleasure from this? Do women feel pity for you and have sex with you more frequently? None of those happened. And this was kind of very surprising to me because I've gone through many treatments. There were many treatments I decided not to do, and I never got this guilt trip to this extent. But I decided not to have this treatment, and I went to his deputy and asked him what was going on. Where's this guilt trip coming from? And he explained that they have done this procedure on 2 patients already, and they need the 3rd patient for a paper they were writing. Now, you'd probably think that this guy is a schmuck, right? That's what it seems like. But let me give you a different perspective on the same story. A few years ago, I was running some of my own experiments in a lab. And when we run experiments, we usually hope that one group will behave differently than another. So we had one group that I hoped their performance would be very high, another group that I thought the performance would be very low. And when I got the results, that's what we got. I was very happy. Aside from one person, there was one person in the group that was supposed to have very high performance that was actually performing terribly. And he pulled the whole mean down, destroying my statistical significance of the test. So I looked carefully at this guy. He was 20-some years older than anybody else in the sample. And I remembered that the drunken guy, came one day to the lab wanting to make some easy cash. And this was the guy. Fantastic, I thought. Let's throw him out. Who would ever include a drunken guy in the sample? But a couple of days later, we thought about it with my students, and we said, what would have happened if this drunken guy was not in that condition? What would have happened if he was in the other group? Would we have thrown him out then? We probably wouldn't have looked at the data at all, and if we did look at the data, we'd probably said, fantastic, what a smart guy who is performing this low, because he would have pulled the mean of the group lower, giving us even stronger statistical result that we could. So we decided not to throw the guy out and to rerun the experiment. But you know, these stories and lots of other experiments that we've done on conflicts of interest basically kind of bring 2 points to the foreground for me. The first one is that in life we encounter many people who, you know, in some way or another try to tattoo our faces, right? They just have the incentives that get them to be blinded to reality and give us advice that is inherently biased. And I'm sure it's something that we all recognize and we see that it happens. Maybe not, we don't recognize every time, but we understand that it happens. The most difficult thing, of course, is to recognize that sometimes we too are blinded by our own incentives. And that's a much, much more difficult lesson to take into account because we don't see how conflicts of interest work on us. When I was doing these experiments, in my mind, I was helping science, right? I was eliminating the data to get the true pattern of the data to shine through. I wasn't doing something bad. In my mind, I was actually, you know, a knight trying to help science move along. But this was not the case. I was actually interfering with the process with lots of good intentions. And I think the real challenge is to figure out where are the cases in our lives where conflicts of interest work on us and try not to trust our own intuition to overcome it, but to try to do things that prevent us from falling prey to these behaviors because we can create lots of undesirable circumstances. I do want to leave you with one positive thought. I mean, this is all very depressing, right? People have conflicts of interest, we don't see it, and so on. The positive perspective, I think, of all of this is that if we do understand when we go wrong, if we understand the deep mechanisms of why we fail and where we fail, we can actually hope to fix things. And that, I think, is the hope. Thank you very much. It would be nice to be objective in life, in many ways. And the problem is that we have these color-tainted glasses, and as we look at all kinds of situations. For example, think about something as simple as beer. If I gave you a few beers to taste and I asked you to rate them on intensity and bitterness, different beers would occupy different space. But what if we tried to be objective about it? In the case of beer, it will be very simple. What if we did a blind taste? Well, if we did the same thing, you tasted the same beer, but now in a blind taste, things would look slightly different. Most of the beers will go into one place. You will basically not be able to distinguish them, and the exception, of course, will be Guinness. Similarly, we can think about physiology. What happens when people expect something from their physiology? For example, we sold people pain medication. Some people, we told them that medications were expensive. Some people, we told them it was cheap. And the expensive pain medication worked better. It relieved more pain from people because expectations do change our physiology. And of course, we all know that in sports, if you're a fan of a particular team, you can't but help see the game develop from the perspective of your team. So all of those are cases in which our preconceived notions and our expectations color our world. What happened in more, let's say, important questions? What happened with questions that have to do with social justice? So we wanted to think about what is the blind tasting version for thinking about inequality. So we started looking at inequality, and we did some large-scale surveys around the US and other countries. So we asked two questions. Do people know what kind of level of inequality we have? And then what level of inequality do we want to have? So let's think about the first question. Imagine I took all the people in the US and I sorted them from the poorest on the right to the richest on the left. And then I divided them into 5 buckets. The poorest 20%, the next 20%, the next, and the richest 20%. And then I asked you to tell me how much wealth do you think is concentrated in each of those buckets. So to make it simpler, imagine I asked you to tell me how much wealth do you think is concentrated in the bottom 2 buckets, the bottom 40%. Take a second, think about it and have a number. Usually we don't think. Think for a second, have a real number in your mind. You have it? Okay, here is what lots of Americans tell us. They think that the bottom 20% have about 2.9% of the wealth. The next group has 6.4, so together it's slightly more than 9. The next group, they say, has 12%, 20. And the richest 20%, people think have 58% of the wealth. You can see how this relates to what you thought. Now, what's reality? Reality is slightly different. The bottom 20% have 0.1% of the wealth. The next 20% have 0.2% of the wealth. Together it's 0.3. The next group has 3.9, 11.3. And the richest group has 85% of the wealth. So what we actually have and what we think we have are very different. What about what we want? How do we even figure this out? So to look at this, to look at what we really want, we thought about the philosopher John Rawls. If you remember John Rawls, he had this notion of what's a just society. He said a just society is a society that if you knew everything about it, you would be willing to enter it in a random place. And it's a beautiful definition, right? Because if you're wealthy, you might want the wealthy to have more money, the poor to have less. If you're poor, you might want more equality. But if you're going to go into that society in every possible situation and you don't know, you have to consider all the aspects. It's a little bit like blind tasting in which you don't know what the outcome would be when you make a decision. And Rawls called this the veil of ignorance. So we took another large group of Americans, and we asked them the question in veil of ignorance. What is the characteristics of a country that would make you want to join it, knowing that you could end randomly in any place? And here is what we got. What did people want to give to the first group, the bottom 20%? They wanted to give them about 10% of the wealth. The next group, 14% of the wealth, 21, 22, and 32. Now, nobody in our sample wanted full equality, right? Nobody thought that socialism is a fantastic idea in our sample. But what does it mean? It means that we have this knowledge gap between what we have and what we think we have, but we have at least as a big gap between what we think is right to what we think we have. Now, we can ask this question, by the way, not just about wealth, we can ask it about other things as well. So, for example, we asked people from different parts of the world about this question. People who are liberals and conservatives, and they gave us basically the same answer. We asked rich and poor, they gave us the same answer. Men and women, NPR listeners and Forbes readers. We asked people in England, Australia, the US, very similar answers. We even asked the different departments of a university. We went to Harvard and we checked almost every department. And the fact from Harvard Business School, where a few people wanted the wealthy to have more and the rich to have less, the similarity was astonishing. I know some of you went to Harvard Business School. We also asked this question about something else. So we asked, what about the ratio of CEO pay to unskilled workers? So you can see what people think is the ratio. And then we can ask the question, what do they think should be the ratio? And then we can ask, what is reality? What is reality? And you could say, well, it's not that bad, right? The red and the yellow are not that different. But the fact is, it's because I didn't draw them on the same scale. It's hard to see, there's yellow and blue in there. So what about other outcomes of wealth? Wealth is not just about wealth. We asked, what about things like health? What about availability of prescription medication? What about life expectancy? What about life expectancy of infants? How do we want this to be distributed? What about education for young people and for older people? And across all of those things, what we learned was that people don't like inequality of wealth, but there's other things that inequality, which is an outcome of wealth, is even more aversive to them. For example, inequality in health or education. We also learned that people are particularly open to changes in inequality when it comes to people who have less agency, basically young kids and baby, because we don't think of them as responsible to their situation. So what are some lessons from this? We have two gaps. We have a knowledge gap and we have a desirability gap. And the knowledge gap is something that we think about, how do we educate people? How do we get people to think differently about inequality and the consequences of inequality in terms of health, education, jealousy, crime rate, and so on. Then we have the desirability gap. How do we get people to think differently about what we really want? You see, the Rawls definition, the Rawls way of looking at the world, the blind tasting approach, takes our selfish motivation out of the picture. How do we implement that to a higher degree on a more extensive scale? And finally, we also have an action gap. How do we take these things and actually do something about it? And I think part of the answer is to think about people like young kids and babies that don't have much agency, because people seem to be more willing to do this. To summarize, I would say next time you go to drink beer or wine, first of all, think about what is it in your experience that is real and what is it in your experience that is a placebo effect coming from expectations. And then think about what it also means for other decisions in your life and hopefully also to policy questions that affect all of us. Thanks a lot.